of Padua, and I'm working within the InsSciDE project. My research is focused on Soviet space diplomacy during the Cold War period. Let's start our lecture with the structure of our lesson. First of all, we will speak about the notion of space for historians who carry out this research. Then we will move on to features of Soviet space diplomacy, starting from the 50s and ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we will end the lecture with the question of who were the protagonists of the Soviet space diplomacy. So let's start to reply to the question, what does it mean, space, for historians who are carrying out research on Soviet space diplomacy. We can't imagine the Soviet space field without facilities, hardware, and devices studied, designed and produced in order to implement manned or unmanned missions in space. Of course, I mean a huge aerospace industry in rocketry, responsible for the construction of spacecraft, launchers, satellites, probes, and telescopes. In the frame of military-industrial establishment, within which included aerospace industry and rocketry, the development of engines, studies in propellants, on rocket ballistics, on performances of construction materials, etc., were conducted. We have to add ground infrastructures as well. For example, launching sites, the famous Baikonur in the Kazakhstan steppe. Here on the photo, you see some important cities that are linked with the name of Sergei Korolev, the founder of Soviet space industry. The so-called Sergei Korolev's empire, together with his associates who worked with him back in the 30s, Korolev created a small empire that transformed many parts of the country. On the left, you see Baikonur, that became the most famous city built according to Korolev's plan. The second most important is Star City, which houses the cosmonaut training center. Less known is Kaliningrad, near Moscow, formerly Podlipki, now Korolev, where a design bureau and an experimental plant were established. It's impossible to imagine space without scientific research carried out in different scientific fields such as astronomy, astrophysics, space medicine, life science, meteorology, and telecommunications. Cosmonautics emerged in Russia at the end of the 19th century thanks to the so-called founder Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. You see his photo on the right. The beginning of space science may be considered by the foundation in 1927 of Popular Society Ossaviahim, Society for the Assistance of Defense, Aircraft and Chemical Construction, that developed space exploration with balloons. After the Second World War, thanks to the development of rocketry, the collaboration between rocket engineers and researchers from the Academy of Science was established. It is no coincidence that the founder of the theory of Soviet cosmonautics was Mstislav Keldysh, president of the Academy of Science. We will talk about him a little bit later. So he was the founder of the theory of Soviet cosmonautics and a strong advocate of scientific launches and collaboration between rocketry and scientists. It was Keldysh that who launched the idea of the Space Research Institute of the USSR Academy of Sciences, that in fact was founded in 1965. It still conducts scientific research in the fields of astrophysics, planetary science, solar physics, Sun-Earth relations, cosmic plasma, and geophysics. To understand the role that the national leadership assigns to the space sector, it becomes important to take into account the economic aspect, particularly the expenses incurred by the state in the space sector. In the case of the USSR, it became interesting to analyze the budget allocated to space expenditures in developing space technologies and carrying out scientific research in the years of so-called space race in the 80s and finally in the 90s. The Soviet space program was closely related to national security issues: nuclear weapons, military rockets, military satellites, air defense system. The technical bureaus that were developing sound rockets, telecommunication satellites, and lunar probes were involved in the military industry and designed hardware for military purposes. By contrast with the USA, where NASA was a civilian organization, all the Soviet airspace industry was classified because it was a part of a military-industrial complex, VPK. Here on the photo you can see on the left Almaz crude military reconnaissance station that was launched for military purposes. Then in the center a military satellite, Zenit 2, and on the right different rockets that were used not only for military purposes, as I said, but for civilian goals. It's also important to keep in mind the cultural aspect of the space. I mean literature, science fiction genre, philosophy, Russian cosmism, art and movies. In pre-revolutionary Russia literature, the interest in space was born with the popular scientific works of Tsiolkovsky and with Alexander Bogdanov's utopian novel Red Star that was published in 1908, his book on the left. After the revolution, the first film that marks the birth of science fiction was shot in Soviet cinema, and it was Protazonov's Elita of 1924. Thanks to the Sputnik effect and therefore to the inauguration of the space age coinciding with the Khrushchevian thaw, the science fiction becomes the privileged genre of technical intelligentsia and a space of intellectual outlet. And I would argue that the ideological aspect is a key feature for interpreting the historical role of Soviet space program in general and international cooperation in the scientific field in particular. As SciDE argues, SciDE is one of the most important American historians who carry out research on this history of Soviet space industry. So SciDE argues that exploration is not a question of individual action, but it is a national affair. Only nations or group of nations had and have resources to develop reliable and effective space transportation systems. In the USSR, the extremely centralized military and industrial sectors, in connection with scientific and technical workers involved in the state projects and closely associated with encouragement and the national punishment system, created conditions of space explorations by manned and unmanned flights. The national dimension of space exploration helps to understand the ideological charge of the Soviet space program. In fact, Soviet achievements in space were an issue of national pride, glorious celebrations, international prestige, and to a certain extent a reason of social sacrifices. During the Cold War, astronautics became the arena of demonstration battles in the confrontation between the two great powers. It symbolized and personified everything: the scientific and technological power of both countries, the achievements of high technologies, intellectual potential, and moral and political unity of society, and the advantages of socialist way of life in our case. Socialism is that reliable launching pad from which the Soviet Union successfully sends its powerful and perfect spaceships into space, wrote Pravda in connection with the flight of German Titov. And here on the photos you can see two important famous meeting of Gagarin after his flight in 1961, the first one with Fidel Castro and the second one with Elizabeth II in London in 1961. Finally, space as an ocean is a very interesting and stimulating issue for historians who work on international relationships and develop research on the role of technology and science in international cooperation and competition during the periods of political and military tensions, such as the Cold War. For example, the European Space Agency, archives of European Space Agency, that helps to reconstruct the character of collaboration between the Soviet Academy of Science and ESA during the Cold War and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Here you can see some works, some books published by different authors, by French, American, and Russian authors, and all these books are dedicated to the history of space exploration. Then I'm moving on to the second part of my lecture that is dedicated to the features of Soviet space diplomacy. The dual military civilian character of the space program profoundly affected the role of science diplomacy in this field. As the space industry was a part of VPK, military industrial complex, it determined some important characteristics of the Soviet space program that conditioned room for maneuver of both professional and not science diplomats. First of all the issues relating to the Soviet space program had a very sensitive nature and represented very closed and highly classified information, by contrast with Americans, who openly published about their space project and about results of their missions. The real place of Soviet rockets liftoff, Baikonur Cosmodrome, was kept in secret by Soviet authorities. During the famous visit of General de Gaulle in Baikonur, the Soviet Secret Service changed the road signs in order to embroil French guests. Often the excessive secrecy precluded the realization of interesting international projects that involved USSR. In 1971, after the failure of the launching of European rockets Europa 2, French and German scientists addressed Soviet authorities and asked them about the possibility to launch their two communication satellites, Symphony with Soviet rocket. The Soviet counterpart offered a very interesting price compared to American offer, but under draconian conditions regarding the launch. No French, no German engineers could access the satellite during transportation over Soviet territory and during launch operations. French team had to close negotiations. And you see the photo of the Symphony satellite on the left. The second feature of Soviet space diplomacy is national security. As part of VPK space industry, it dealt with national security questions and was directly involved in the development of military hardware. Missiles, spacecraft, satellites, and space stations were projected and produced in the same technical bureaus and plants as the hardware assigned for civilian and scientific missions. And a very interesting and emblematic example was the mission, Comet Halley mission. In 1980, when the director of the Institute for Space Research, Roland Sagdiyev, tried to convince the Military Industrial Commission to participate in the international mission to Comet Halley, he argued that Soviet built hundreds and thousands of silos for ICBMs in order to deter the Americans. But there they could be perceived only as dummies. Instead, a spectacular launch with shooting at several targets at the same time would not only be impressive, but would also serve as an intelligent deterrence. Here you can see the stamp dedicated to this international mission. Another consequence of the military nature of Soviet space program was the fact that in the USSR the development and application of cutting-edge technologies were basically for military use. The advanced technologies developed in different fields of science were scarcely introduced in the civilian industry, and the society didn't receive relevant profits from scientific knowledge acquired from the development of the space program. In the 90s, this marginalized role of the space industry in Soviet society that didn't benefit from advanced space technologies served as a dirty trick. Space exploration lost its unpopularity, typical for golden space age. The funding from the national budget was cut, along with the number of workers involved in the space industry, whose profession became much less prestigious than in Soviet times. The second feature of the Soviet space program was its reliance on domestic politics and national economic priorities. The very centralized political system, from one hand, simplified the decision-making process. The long-staying power of some officials ensured the stability of the space program and the directions of its development. So Brezhnev remained in power as the first secretary of the Communist Party for 16 years. On the other hand, the complex bureaucratic system, the non-market nature of competition between the chief designers of rocketry, and the confused distribution of functions within the design and production system led to serious consequences for the entire aerospace field. Brezhnev could not decide between two competitive projects on the future heavy boosters. You can see I'm speaking about the booster that is on the right. One was promoted by Glushkov's design bureau, where the final results were the SS-18 rockets. At the same time, Chelomey, another chief designer, constructor, led a team of competitors with their version SS-19, and you see it on the photo. The head of the Soviet state chose both projects to be developed. And finally, the third feature of Soviet space diplomacy is the fact that the political situation had no less reliance on the Soviet space program and its international involvement similarly to domestic policy. Furthermore, I guess it's possible to take note that relations in space were a kind of litmus test that reflected the trends of international relations. Just remember the first Soviet-American agreement about coordination of efforts in different fields of space exploration of 1962. When it became known about the missiles on Cuba, Kennedy issued an order according to which the American side should not take any action within the framework of bilateral agreements in outer space between the United States and the USSR until the situation around Cuba was not being settled. But already on October 30, 2 days after Khrushchev and Kennedy reached an understanding on a way out of this situation, the head of space program exchanged letters. Obviously, the mutual desire for a space partnership was the best symbol of the two leaders' desire to disperse the clouds in Soviet-American relations. Taking into account all features mentioned above, in the USSR a very narrow space for professional science diplomacy remained. And finally, I'm moving on to the last part of my lecture that is dedicated to the protagonists of the Soviet space diplomacy. First of all, the decisions were up to the first secretaries of the Communist Party. People involved in the space program recognized Khrushchev's great merits in developing space exploration. He was the first Soviet leader to understand the ideological importance of space exploration and was therefore willing to grant enormous funding for the technological and scientific development of the aerospace sector. High-ranking public officials from state institutions and Communist Party structure were directly involved in the decision-making process. At least 9 ministries of industries were classified as the indispensable part of the defense establishment. On the left, you can see Ustinov Dmitry Fedorovich, the Central Committee Secretary in charge of the Soviet military-industrial complex. But he was also a Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union from 1976 until his death in 1984. And another person that we can see on this slide is Afanasyev Sergei. He was a Minister of General Machine Building, one of the most important ministries involved in the Soviet space program. Chief constructors and engineers of upper ranks had a very important role and were able to suggest new firsts and priorities of cosmonautics development. It was Sergei Korolev, now finally we can see his photo, who was making his proposals of records to Khrushchev in order to overcome Americans. Engineers directly involved in implementing international projects such as Soyuz Apollo and French-Soviet common projects. Chertok Boris Chertok, the vice chief designer, reasoned about the historical paradox of astronautics. He suggested that it was in fact the advances in rocket technology that stimulated confrontation between the two superpowers, and the sources of manned programs based on these achievements fostered rapprochement, cooperation, and the desire to exchange ideas and experience. Here on the photo you can see Saromyatnikov Vladimir, who was the engineer who was involved in the construction of the docking system for the Soviet-American project Soyuz Apollo. If just a few engineers were allowed to enter personal contact with their foreign partners, the scientists from this point of view were more privileged. If normal engineers didn't speak foreign languages, a lot of Soviet scientists spoke French. For example, Keldysh, we have already spoken about him. He was a director of the president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So he spoke French. And this helped scientists to establish personal contacts and, in some cases, even friendship with their international colleagues during conferences, encounters, workshops, and annual meetings in the frame of different collaboration. Here we can see Roald Sagdeev, who was the director of the Institute of Space Research of the Academy of Sciences. The last very important group of non-professional space diplomats were cosmonauts and astronauts. Their visibility and the official status of their figures assigned to their office an enormous diplomatic task that they had to carry out without having acquired the specific knowledge and skills. It is no coincidence that Gagarin assumes the unofficial title Messenger of Peace after having made numerous trips around the world. German Titov's, the second cosmonaut, German Titov's visit to the United States in 1962 demonstrated the detente between the two countries after the Cuban crisis. Here in the photo you can see the moment of the meeting between American astronauts and the Soviet cosmonauts during the program Soyuz Apollo. And I'm moving on my conclusions. I suggest that Soviet space sector is more related to politics, both domestic and international, and much less to scientific interests and researchers' aspirations, even if the scientific research in the space exploration was quite developed during the space age. In the same time of the Cold War, space diplomacy was an important instrument of coping with international tensions. It was both the means of overcoming conflicts and a litmus test that demonstrated the current status of the relationship between two or more countries. My point is the real space diplomats were scientists who were able to establish a strong relationship with foreign partners, to maintain it using the bureaucratic apparatus of Soviet system and developing it even in the moments of international tensions of the Cold War, like Comet Halley International Mission. I thank you for your attention and I hope to see you soon. Bye.